In the late 80s film, The Princess Bride, kind of a cult classic and one of my favorites, there's this villainous character named Vincini. And Vincini is commissioned, paid to kidnap the young and the innocent, beautiful Princess Buttercup, in part to start a war with a rival kingdom. There's a recurring statement that he makes. He thinks of himself as this perfect planner. He's a great mastermind. But in the process of kidnapping the princess, his plan starts to fall apart. And the recurring phrase that he says every time it falls apart, and you can watch the movie as to why it falls apart. And by the way, if you haven't seen The Princess Bride, you're not living. But every moment that his plan begins to break down, he says, inconceivable. And one of his partnering henchmen, a great swordsman by the name of Inigo, at one point, after hearing this word inconceivable, he turns to Vincini and he says, how come you keep using that word? I don't think you, Vincini, really knows you don't really know the meaning of that term. And that's the scene in the movie. Kind of this, it's a comedy. The scene in the movie has been playing around in my mind of late. There's quite a bit of divisive language. America is divided, and there's some a bit of a there's some language, there's some terminology, especially in this time of unrest, where you have a pandemic that is sort of laying bare or demonstrating the sort of nakedness of our political system and our political ideology. But there's certain phrases and words that have been recurring that I find myself like Indigo saying, I don't think you know the meaning of that term. Donald Trump, President Trump, has regularly used radical left to describe, I think, anyone who is his enemy. That is that anyone who crosses Donald Trump is a puppet of the radical left, or that the Democrats or Nancy Pelosi and others, not Republicans or not conservative or not on the right, are radical leftists. In his last State of the Union address, he used this charged language of battling the radical left. And in his recent 4th of July speech in Washington, D.C., he also presented himself as one who would gather others to battle the radical left. One journalist said that you can give Donald Trump the benefit of the doubt in that he really hasn't done his homework. What I mean by that is that he doesn't know what Marxism means, he doesn't know what socialism means, and he certainly doesn't know what radical or left means in America, nor does he understand or know the power or lack of power among those that associate with the radical left. There are those who conscientiously understand the concept of radical and also left. There are Marxists in America. There are anarchists. There are socialists. But I would argue, and others would argue, that they do not have, at this point, the power to overturn the very strong inverted totalitarian neoliberal state that is characteristic of American power right now. And it's not just the right that supports this scheme, it is also those who we associate with the left, like Democrats and liberals. In other words, what I'm saying is that the Democrats are not radical, they are not left. And I want to take this mini lecture to unpack the term radical and left. I should also mention just in passing here that Donald Trump has characterized the radical and the left as fascists. So radical left in defeating fascism. Fascism is historically associated with the far right. So not only does Donald Trump not know anything about the radical left, of anarchism, of Marxism, of socialism, nor does he know anything about fascism, largely because, as I will demonstrate in the next lecture, that he is more associated with fascism itself. And again, he doesn't know, he may not like that, and others may not like the reality of being associated with fascism. Fascism and Marxism, you have to disentangle in terms of the history of the term. So that's what I want to do today. I want to define these terms, not in the sense of defending the radical left, but for us to get a better understanding. Language nowadays in America is getting out of hand. There is a corporate media circus that is generating fear and anxiety among the voting bloc, among voting citizens, and I think that the language is a little bit dangerous. I have two images on the initial screen here that I think may be a bit helpful for us in terms of not understanding the terms that we use. Notice on the left-hand side, around the time that in the mid to late 50s, when schools were desegregating, the Supreme Court decided that segregation was a badge of inferiority and therefore a violation of the 14th Amendment, and then the incorporated Bill of Rights in that 14th Amendment. Many believe that the government intrusion to desegregate schools was itself communism. Well, it's nowhere near what communism is. And notice the picture on the right, someone who is opposed to the social distancing and mask wearing, I assume, mask wearing directives of governors and mayors across the country. And granted, maybe some of these many of these executive orders are somewhat over the top or can themselves be enforced. The idea of social distancing is nowhere near communism. You see, communism in America, or the claim of communism, has been a favorite term of reactionaries. We often associate them with conservatives. Conservative means to conserve traditional ways of life. And if you are involved in conserving things that are true, good, and beautiful, then conservatism is fine. And we could talk a little bit more about that. But conservatism in America has largely been reactionary. And the sort of steroid boost to reactionaries has always been, clamorous shouts of communism. Whenever the government becomes large and intrusive, whether it's by way of desegregating, whether it's by way of taxation, and that's the big one, taxation, and the current crisis of governing and federal guidelines, state and federal guidelines, to suppress the sort of revived outbreak of this deadly coronavirus, there are claims of communists. Or, you know, anyone who is sort of losing the political high ground, or even the cultural high ground, what some scholars call status anxiety. Status anxiety, when you're losing the cultural high ground, you accuse your enemy, let's say the Democratic Party, as being communists. Right? Democrats are communists and socialists. Joe Biden, I recently saw a headline in a corporate news agency. Joe Biden is a pawn of the radical left. Right? Joe Biden is a communist. Obama is a socialist and a communist. Also happens to be a Nazi and a fascist. And once again, these reflect an ignorance of terminology. So let's get right to it. What do we mean by radical? Well, the term nowadays is being thrown around as if people know directly the definition of that term, radical or radicalism. But according to Lauren Corelli and Nigel Smith, radicalism is an evasive concept. It does not lend itself to easy categorization. In other words, it's very difficult to define. Christopher Hill, however, realizing that there's an absence of a strict definition of the term, says this: one should arguably go beyond merely claiming that the absence of a word to describe phenomena does not mean that these phenomena are nothing but a figment of the observer's imagination. So we may not have a hard and fast definition of radicalism, but there are features that we can associate with what we might call radicalism. There is a way to define it. Radical comes from the Latin radix, meaning root, and refers to activities that get at the root of social, economic, scientific, religious, and political issues. Now, much of my talk today will talk about socioeconomic and political radicalism, but there is radical changes and movements, oftentimes unintended, that introduce new ways of living. And this makes radicalism and revolution, political or social revolution or economic revolution, very closely connected to one another. You also know that as you should also notice that social, economic, scientific, religious, and political radicalism, thereby comes in these different strata or different layers. There may be a scientific revolution. This is what we call a paradigm shift that may not have an impact on revolutionizing political structures. It may, but it may not. There may be a religious revolution, unintended religious revolutions, or by the way, in the scientific revolution, we call them paradigm shifts. Paradigm shifts are revolutions. Keep in mind that this does not necessarily mean that there's just scientific changes or religious changes or economic changes. Okay? Going from an iPhone 4 to an iPhone 5, or whatever the number is nowadays, that's not a revolutionary change, no matter what advertisements may give to us. A revolution, a radical revolution, is a complete overhaul of a previous way of living. Though it's not an eradication of the memory of a past life, but that memory and the current habits need to adjust to the new ways of living. So a scientific revolution may be the change from going from a heliocentric view of the world to a geocentric view of the world to a heliocentric view of the world. And the transition is never easy. It's always messy, and it's always contested. We talk about the Industrial Revolution in economics. That was not simple, that was not one day, and that was not easy to adjust to. Same with political revolutions, like the American Revolution. Previous ways of life or previous habits and previous memories don't automatically disappear. However, the conditions change such that you have to adjust your ways of living to live in the new, world. Now, as it relates to politics, society, and economics, John Stuart Mill, or I should say before John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham was the first to really capitalize on that term, radicalism, as it relates to politics and society. And his follower, John Stuart Mill, identified the radical as one, the radical individual, as one who refuses to compromise with evils in society by cutting at the roots, but cuts at the roots, it's at the root of the problem. John McKinnon Robertson says, radicalism means going to the root of things in political action. And notice, it's not simply a matter of tearing things up by the roots, but of planting institutions anew on just principles. A radical is not someone, historically, a radical is not someone who just wants to undermine institutions and ways of life. They want to find ways to live a better life and a more just life. Maybe we could, and sometimes radicals are associated with reformers. I'll get to that in a moment. The Journal of the Study of Radicalism, published by Michigan State University, associates the word radical with those who seek revolutionary alternatives to hegemonic social and political institutions and who use violent or nonviolent means to resist authority and to bring about change. So again, it's a matter of going back to the roots. And sometimes going to the roots of a problem means to go to the origin of a problem. If an institution has become corrupt, oftentimes reformers will go back to the roots to effect a meaningful change. And even though they act as reformers, going back to the roots, they oftentimes evolve into radicals because they, in an unintended way, have radically, at the root, reformed or changed the particular institution, okay? So dealing with the, let's say, the existence and the habits of a slavery, trying to eradicate slavery means that you have to get to the root of the problem. But if you were to ignore the roots of slavery, which a lot of, in my field of study, the anti-slavery movement, a lot of people were interested in eradicating slavery, but not eradicating the roots of slavery. And that's why slavery has come, as Frederick Douglass said, as Wendell Phillips says, that slavery has returned in different forms because we've ignored the roots of the problem. And I want to keep saying this to those, let's say, who are protesting right now, the George Floyd protests. These are not radical if you ignore the roots of the problem. And if I can add another sort of recommendation in dealing with issues of racism and sexism, we are not going to make much of a dent in racism if we simply diversify the workforce. Now that's a start. There is sacrifices that we need to make. We need to diversify the workforce, and I understand that. But these are only sort of thin, these sort of gossamer thin band-aids. They don't look at the root causes of inequality in the country. So don't stop there. You got to drill down deeper. So now let's consider the term left. Well, the term left actually can go way back to the French Revolution. In the Estates General, around the time of the outbreak of the French Revolution, the Estates General in France is basically the parliament that's called by the king. And you had three basic units. You had the nobility, you had the church, and then you had everybody else. Largely self-made professionals, small property owners, etc. But they made up a majority. But in the estates, each estate received one vote. And those in power included the church and the nobility. So really the church and the nobility, they got 2 votes compared to the third estate, which got 1 vote. So they always stayed in power. Well, this was a corrupt, this had become a corrupt system. It didn't represent the people in France, and it didn't deal with a lot of the economic and plague issues that were harassing France for quite some time. And so the third estate said, forget it, we're starting a whole new system. That is a radical move on their part. But anyway, at the Estates Generals, the nobility and the king, and the nobility and the clergy, they sat on the right side. Everyone else who were fighting for greater democracy, they sat on the left side. You had the left and the right. And those who fought throughout the long 19th century for greater democratic rights against political systems that tried to go back to an old kingly system and nobility and the reestablishment of the church, they were considered more of the right. They were conservative. So those that fought for the majority of the people, not just property owners of the middling class, but those even below them, those without riches, the sans-culottes, the left was associated with greater democracy, greater in the sense of allowing basically a new sort of political term that came into use, the people, give the people more practical involvement in governance. So the left and democracy have been sort of associated with one another in history. Again, it hasn't always been that way. Sometimes these are disconnected. These are fragile relationships. But in America, by about the 1930s, radicalism had come to be associated with the left. Georgetown historian Michael Kazin says the left is that social movement or congeries of mutually sympathetic movements that are dedicated to a radically egalitarian transformation of society. Think democracy. Mary Buell and Paul Buell define the American left, these are also 2 historians, define the American left as that segment of society that has sought fundamental changes in the economic, political, and cultural systems, a segment that has overwhelmingly included anarchists, socialists, and communists. I want to talk about anarchists and socialists in just a moment. And oftentimes, I should say, socialism and communism are oftentimes used interchangeably. Even Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels often use them interchangeably. But I find socialism more of a concrete, or it has more of a concrete definition. Communism can tend to be a little bit sort of motto-driven or romantic. But there is something helpful, a sort of salient definition to communism. But for the most part, we're going to use them interchangeably. Now, another word that we use, look on the right side. If you look at the right side of the screen, progressive. Progressive is also a term that we hear today, often associated with the left, sometimes associated with radicals. But there is a central word for progressive. This doesn't mean progress. It doesn't mean evolution. It doesn't mean it doesn't even mean getting rid of institutions that we are familiar with, like the system of government, or even capitalism. The center of the word progressive, get this in your mind, central to the word progressive is simply reform. Reform. Now, let's zero in on this even more. Reforming what? Reforming social and political institutions that will give greater democracy, greater say to the citizens of a country. In the late 19th century, in America, the period that we refer to, or Mark Twain referred to as the Gilded Age, this was a period of time when capitalism, the second industrial revolution, capitalism was the freest it's ever been in America. And during that time, when capitalism was able to run rampant with very little oversight, around this time, the first antitrust or anti-monopoly law, the Sherman Antitrust Act, was passed, and it was very weak. It was very difficult to enforce the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up monopolies. Capitalism was able to freely expand with very little restrictions. Now, what you have to understand about capitalism is the logic of capitalism is that it does not feed, it does not thrive on competition. It does not thrive on democracy. It thrives on, or it seeks, the telos of capitalism is to eliminate competition in order to reach a monopoly. And in the process of doing that, it has to eliminate the voice of human beings, the voice of people. And this is the reason why you see in the late 19th century and early 20th century, the rise of radical labor activism, the rise of anarchists and socialists and Marxism. Citizens across the American continent, in both the rural and the agrarian and the urban sector, farmers and industrial workers found Marx or Edward Bernstein, who's an evolutionary socialist, different type of socialist, or evolutionary socialists like Lawrence Grundlin or J.A. Wayland, all different from Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Nonetheless, they found socialism very attractive. You see, many progressives realize that as capitalism grows, democracy shrinks. And so there are practical implementations of electoral functions like the referendum, the initiative, and the recall, the direct election of senators. 1917, which was an effort to make these monopolies that have a huge major political power, make them more accountable to the people. So beginning in Wisconsin, and then ironically, Wisconsin, right? Beginning in Wisconsin, you have these progressive items of legislation where the citizens can democratically elect or vote to remove a governor. Maybe there's a governor who is passing laws that favors corporations, maybe an oil industry, Standard Oil at the time, okay? That's the kind of corruption that progressives by the 20th century were battling. So it gave greater democracy to the people. And one motivating factor behind this, I mean, there were capitalist liberals, but there were also anarchists, socialists, and Marxists, evolutionary socialists, Christian socialists, social gospelers, who were fighting, pushing for these democratic reforms in America, because democracy was being taken away by the capitalists. Another term that Donald Trump actually used in his 4th of July speech was this word anarchism. Anarchism does not mean lawlessness. It doesn't mean destroying everything and just leaving it at that. Anarchists make a distinction between citizens, people who regularly govern themselves, and we govern ourselves all the time. I don't communicate with any government. I may be under a government, but there's the people and the governing of the people separate from a governing state, right? A government, a governing state. So the anarchists don't want to get rid of legislation. They don't want to get rid of governing. They want to get rid of a separate governing state. Paul and Mary Buell say most leftists have believed that the state came into existence when civilization began to produce surpluses controlled by elites who found it useful to create coercive institutions to protect their privileges from internal and external changes. The elimination of the state would therefore eliminate these sources, material sources of inequality. Anarchists favor governance executed not by an external state, but by local people. They argue for the creation of local and regional confederations of voluntary associations. And you may say, oh, anarchism, that doesn't work out. You'd be surprised. In Europe, there are anarchist co-ops like Mondragon co-op in Spain. Let me show you an example. I work here in Shanghai at a small, independent, the first of its kind, liberal arts college in China. We partner with a school in downtown Shanghai, the Mondragon Team Academy. This is part of Mondragon University. This is a program whereby college students come together and they have tutors, and they plan, initiate, and put into place entrepreneurial businesses, small businesses. And many of the students here at Tsinghua are actually, where I work, haven't just proposed plans, but they've actually put them in place, and they are making money from it. This is one of our students here. I won't show you the video. This is an image of the start of the Mondragon Team Academy in Shanghai. This man here happens to be one of the professors here at the college. He's also my neighbor. This young man from Spain, he's one of the tutors or the directors of the Mondragon school. And the anarchistic nature of this program is that students work together in teams democratically. There's no sort of managerial dictatorship. And that's what anarchism economically wants to focus on. It wants to give power to the people. In this case, Mondragon, to give power to the students. And Mondragon in Spain is a successful anarchist establishment. Certainly has its problems. It's being tempted certainly by corporate managerialism, which they need to deal with. And we should keep in mind there are anarchist co-ops in the Middle East, throughout the Middle East. There are anarchist co-ops, Commonwealth co-ops in the US, like Twin Oaks in Virginia, or other, which is part of the Federation of Communes. And there are other communes throughout the United States, in Missouri, Virginia, in Ohio. Small communities where people work and they own what they produce and the means of production, they own it communally. Now, I doubt anyone, most people, know anything about these co-ops. Are these anarchists who are also socialists? And we'll talk about that in a second. Are they destroying the American dream? Are they destroying the American system? I'm not advocating for them. I'm just saying, I'm not really afraid of them. I'm not afraid of these co-ops. Well, that gets us into, before we get to socialism, let me just finish up with the anarchists. The Pittsburgh Congress of 1883, there was a Congress of anarchist organizations that promoted in its manifesto such goals as equal rights for all without distinction of sex or race, and regulation of all public affairs by free contracts between the autonomous, that is independent communes and associations, resting upon a federalistic basis. But anarchists faced significant oppression, especially in the late 19th century. In 1886, there was a bomb was detonated in the Haymarket Square in Chicago. And it was blamed on foreign anarchists and public intellectuals and organizers like this man here, Alan Parsons, see, commemorated, and all of these other men. Alan Parsons was not involved in the terroristic activities at the Haymarket Square, but it didn't matter to law enforcement, it didn't matter to the courts. In fact, the courts, there was no evidence tying Alan Parsons to the bomb that was thrown, killing a number of people, including police officers, and injuring many more. The judge in the case decided that because Alan Parsons was part of what the judge believed to be a treasonous organization as an anarchist, that he was intent in destroying America's way of life and America's government, and he was executed. And there were case after case after case. One famous case was the Sacco Vanzetti case. Two anarchists who were charged with a high crime. There was no evidence. In fact, the evidence proved otherwise. This is, I think, what reformers and radicals, leftists and progressives, if they seek to make a change, and they have the courage to make the change, they have to realize that they are going to face the heaviness of the status quo. The corporate elite, the corporate hegemony, and those that support that corporate, who have imbibed the opiate of the corporate state. They're going to face the heavy hand of the establishment, as we might say. Noam Chomsky, the famous anarchist at MIT, I don't think he is interested in undermining America, but he's an outspoken anarchist, has defined all the different strands of anarchism to say that what's shared among all the different anarchist groups, because you've got libertarian anarchists, you've got socialist anarchists, is this. What they share is this: a skepticism about any form of authority or domination or submission. Specifically what Chomsky says is governing authorities, particularly the state, needs to legitimize its authority. If it cannot legitimize its authority, what right or what justification does it have to exist? So again, we have to be careful about how these terms are used. The Chapel Hill Autonomous Zone, later renamed the Capitol Hill Occupy protest in Seattle, many were denouncing as anarchists. Now, I think there was an element of anarchism in it when the people took over a public building, a taxpayer building. That we could say that's an anarchist move, because it's really, I mean, who owns it but the people? And see, the problem in the minds of the anarchists is that the government says that it owns, governing elites own that which is public. They have privatized that which is public. Now that may be one strain, but for the most part, if you've read the Chaz or CHOP demands, and there are over 30 demands from different sources, they recognize the legitimacy of the state. So they're not anarchists in the traditional sense of the term. Plus, they've been removed by the establishment. Okay, now let's get into socialism. Sorry, I had to see if the air conditioning is on. It's getting a little bit hot in here. Okay. Socialism. Going back to the 19th century, the very basic level, socialism was simply related to those, or a socialist was one who wanted to deal with the negative social consequences of industrialization. That's it. Unfettered industrial capitalism in parts of England was having a seriously negative impact on the lives of certain people. Pollution, a loss of life, and that's in the industrial sector. You can see in mining, which fueled industrialization, there's child labor, overworked, exhaustion, health concerns. And so intellectuals, before they became known as sort of intellectuals, writers and journalists and academics began to consider, well, how can we make industrialization better, more humane? That's actually what a socialist meant early on. But as it related to the economy, when we talk about socialism, we do talk about capitalism. Socialism is concerned with democracy within economic relations. Or as one economist, socialist has said, democracy at work, within the confines of work. That is, it seeks democratic practices within economic relations. That is, workers making decisions regarding labor, hours, their pay, etc. Not cutting them off from that, and not allowing a small elite of plutocratic rulers make decisions for workers, the workers who are creating the value and the profits for the corporate board. Broadly speaking, socialism is a yearning, Richard Wolff says, socialism is a yearning for people living in a capitalist economic system, whether private or state capitalist, to do better than what the capitalism permits, that capitalism permits and enables. Socialists want to be able to explore and develop their full potential as individuals, as humans, and members of society while contributing to its welfare and growth. Socialists believe such desires are generally frustrated for most people in capitalist societies. So workers want greater say, greater democratic activity in the economy. Workers and laborers, according to socialists, should own the means of their production. Own the means of production. Now, Bernie Sanders is often talked about as a socialist. I'm skeptical of that. I've been skeptical of that. I'm not exactly sure. I'm not confident that he is, but he did say something that was socialistic in his last, or second to the last Democratic debate before he dropped out. Bernie Sanders suggested to Michael Bloomberg, a billionaire, that workers should sit on corporate boards and make decisions related to the company. That's not, that, to me, that doesn't seem outrageous, and it's certainly not radical based on the definition of radical. What was Michael Bloomberg's response to that? Literally, quote unquote, absolutely not. Workers should not be on corporate boards. You see, Michael Bloomberg, the epitome of a non-democratic capitalist, does not want to give power to the workers. He doesn't want to make their life better. Now, capitalists talk about themselves as being democratic, but that democracy is severely restricted. Democracy for the capitalist ends at the factory door, or the corporation door, the gate, right? So in other words, democracy is, well, look, you can choose to work for Amazon or not. You could choose to work for Walmart or not, go hungry, not have a job. That to me is not very democratic. All or nothing, right? But once you enter Walmart, once you enter, you have no more choice. Choices are made by those at the top. Plutocracy, the oligarchy. But that also, taking away your democratic rights, you know, when you say, okay, fine, I have no choice, Walmart's come into my town, it's destroyed all small businesses are gone, or they've outsourced, or businesses have outsourced to different countries. The only place that I can work is Walmart, which is not really much of a choice, so I'm going to choose to work there. That restricted democracy also allows the employer to say, well, look, you chose to work here, so we can do whatever we want to you. You can work in harsh conditions. You can work overtime. You can spend the majority of your time and your day away from your children, away from your family. We don't have to give you health care. Walmart doesn't have to give you health care. You got a state system that would allow you to get health care. Amazon, the same thing. All the while, you are working, creating the value, and this is going to be the heart of the definition of socialism. Sorry, the definition of capitalism. You are creating value for the corporate elite who's not working themselves. The 19th century term for this was that taking the surplus was called fleecing. Taking the value that was produced by the workers. Well, if the workers are producing value, shouldn't they have a say in how much they get paid, in how long they have to work? Seems reasonable to me. And there's very limited choices now. Most of in the manufacturing sector, tech industry, airlines, the pharmaceutical companies, major industries in America have been reduced to a very small handful of corporations. They've been consolidated. The banking industry as well, I should include in that group. So there's very little choice that people have. There's very little consumer choice in what people have. The tech industry, manufacturing, banking, airlines, and pharmaceuticals. So not much of a choice. So you know, but then of course, when people bring this up, when I say, look, I don't want Walmart in my town. Too bad. You're forced to choose. Well, that's not a choice. It's not a choice at all. So it gives power back to, socialism gives power back to the workers, Workers own the means of production, and the state acts as the arbiter to make sure non-producers, that is capitalists or the managers, do not steal from those who are producing the value. Right? Socialism doesn't have to doesn't require a overbearing, huge state. But that's what has fueled in America claims of communism. Whenever the state gets too large or too intrusive, oh, it's socialistic, it's communistic. You don't need a big government. A big government is not indicative of socialism or even the coming of socialism. Let's continue. Marx and Engels, in their famous Communist Manifesto, define socialism, communism as an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. In another place, Marx writes, the establishment of communism, or socialism, comes when the individual producer receives back from society, after the deductions have been made, exactly what he gives to it. Exactly what he gives to it. The motto of communism of the 19th century was each according to his ability, each according to his need. And there's always a way to gauge someone's ability to satisfy that person's need. The problem is that this has all been obscured by fear language, status anxiety language. But think about it for a moment. Each according to his ability, each according to his needs. The individual producer receives back from society exactly what he gives to it. So Amazon workers working in crowded facilities, not getting adequate health care, barely making ends meet, are producing the value for Jeff Bezos, who in 5 years will become the first trillionaire in history. During the pandemic, in 1 week, Jeff Bezos has made $12.5 million. $12.5 million. Jeff Bezos, in 2 minutes, makes over, in terms of his net worth, makes over, transferred in cash, makes over $100,000 in 1 minute. What does he do to make that much money? His net worth is over $120 billion. What is he doing? What is the amount of labor that he expels to get him $125 billion annually? This is truly inconceivable. The worker, where does he get that value from? It comes from those at the bottom. So what do we do? You know, what's the result? You know, how do we change this? You notice on the right here, this is a favorite park that my family and I like to go to. It's Fuxing Park in Shanghai. And I've taken a friend here before, but this is a famous statue of Marx and Engels. Anyway. Now, one way we can define socialism is defining what it is not. We hear on the news that socialism is bad because it takes away all your property and distributes all your property to everyone else. That's not true. Throughout the 19th century, and the various socialists, evolutionary socialists, Christian socialists, scientific socialists, a cooperative commonwealth, socialists, they're not talking about taking away everyone's property and just willy-nilly giving it out equally. Again, it's based on what you contribute to society, what you get in return. Okay? Workers who are creating the value in the economy should be getting a high rate of return, more so than the corporate elite. Notice these two quotes in the Communist Manifesto, right? You know that, you know the Communist Manifesto, that evil, satanic work. Marx and Engels say this: the abolition of existing property relations is not at all a distinctive feature of communism. Abolition of existing relations is not at all a distinctive feature of communism. The distinguishing feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property. What they mean by that, a certain type of property. So if you've ever thought to yourself, property has become so sacred, it was then in the 19th century and even now, that if you ever touch private property, my goodness, that's heretical, and you're going straight to hell for doing that. I'm being hyperbolic. It's certain types of capital. Marx was critical of the anarchists, Proudhon in particular, who believed that all property was theft. Marx wrote a philosophical treatise against that idea, against Proudhon. It's not the abolition of bourgeois property. And by the way, if you were in the 19th century and you were battling anti-slavery, you were saying that the slaves had a right to property, and that beginning, the very fundamental right of property is the ownership of the self. And that's why slavery was wrong. One of the reasons why slavery was wrong, that slaves had a right to own themselves and own their own labor. You know what? You would have been labeled as socialist and a communist. If you believe that slavery, human chattel slavery, whereby someone owns another human being as an item of property, however you want to call it, own that person as an item, de facto, you own that person as an item of property, and you think that's wrong and that should not be, you might be a socialist. Oh no, we're gonna I'll freak out. Look at the last paragraph. Hard-won, self-acquired, self-earned property. Do you mean the property of the petty artisan, that small artisan, and of the small peasant, a form of property that preceded the bourgeois form? There's no need to abolish that. The development of industry has to a great extent already destroyed it and is still destroying it daily. The small market, the small business owner, right? This is what a lot of people will respond to the socialists. Well, what about small businesses? They go under. What about the entrepreneur, like the students at Mondragon University in Shanghai, right? They've got their businesses. All that will be taken away. No, it won't. That's not the intent of the very Bible of communism, the Communist Manifesto. They don't support that at all. You can go here in Shanghai. My family and I visit in Shanghai 500-year-old markets, beautiful market canal water towns. And some people go to these markets. They're like large but ancient farmers markets. And they're still, we buy and sell, and people are buying, selling their markets. People may say, well, how can you have this in a communist system? If you don't understand the nature of communism, you don't understand the nature of socialism. I mean, that question alone reflects an ignorance of socialism and communism. As Terry Eagleton has said in his book, Why Marx Was Right. You can have markets. You can have supply and demand in a communist socialist system. But notice what they say at the end, what Marx and Engels says, there's no need to abolish the small property owner. The development of industry has to a great extent already destroyed it. Socialists and communists are not taking property away. They're actually giving property back to its rightful owner. Who's taking property? Who's taking property away? Not the looters across the country. It's the capitalists. The capitalists are destroying the petty art, the property of the petty artisan, the property of the small business owner. They're the ones taking it away. Walmart is taking away the property of the small business owner. It's not communism and socialism that's doing that. Now, the government is taking small property of small businesses away by supporting the consolidation of larger corporations, by bailing out major corporations. So in a sense, yeah, the government, both Republican and Democrats, are not interested in protecting the interests of small business. And that's what we're losing. We're losing that recognition. We're imbibing the hooch, the opiate of the hegemonic corporate state. What we need to do is we need to go back to the origins of these issues. So we need to be careful about the fiery political language. Don't be afraid. Those that cry in the media and among presidents, among political parties, the radical left is not, that much of a danger. It's not a powerhouse. And there are things that they say that I think we can evaluate on the basis of truth, on the basis of beauty, and on the basis of justice. Now, some may ask, what has socialism done? What has anarchism done? Well, I've given you examples of small entrepreneurial businesses and startups, even whole communities, small communities that are anarchists and co-op, and they're successful. Small but successful. But what about socialists? Socialism does not work. Well, frankly, capitalism cannot exist without it collapsing every 10 years. It's got to collapse, and then it's got to revive it. So capitalism, by nature, is destructive. I mean, you can almost say the contradiction of capitalism is that it works by not working, by failing. Well, what of socialism? What has socialism done for us? Socialism is a complete failure. Well, you like your weekends? You like workers' comp? You like the fact that children don't have to work 10 to 12 hours a day? Do you like your 8-hour day? Do you appreciate your Social Security? Do you value some of the political functioning reforms in the Constitution? Do you support the end of slavery? Do you also support the valuing of human life? Much of these have come from socialists in America. It hasn't led to genocide. Those that have utilized socialism and communism for genocide have been afraid of losing their power. There's a difference between the system and those who are in power itself. In our next lecture, I will discuss the dominant ideology. An ideology that is, I would say, hurting the American way of life. And it's not socialism, it's not radicalism, it's not the left. Although I think we need some courageous radical leftists to confront the dominant ideology of the 21st century. So stay tuned.